On a cold, silent night, a shadow moved through the streets, unseen but always watching. For decades, he had evaded capture, leaving chaos in his wake. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the law was closing in. He remembered the first time he tasted power, small thefts, clever deceptions, moments that seemed insignificant at the time. Each act taught him, each lie sharpened his mind, preparing him for the dark path that lay ahead. Across the city, police analysts studied maps, connecting years of crimes, piecing together clues that had been overlooked for too long. Patterns emerged, and a net was slowly tightening, designed to catch the man who had always stayed one step ahead. In secret rooms and hidden corners, he met with accomplices, exchanging messages and objects with caution. Every glance, every word, carried the weight of mistrust. The streets outside whispered warnings he could no longer ignore. Even the most calculated plans could not escape reality. Fear crept in like a cold wind through the cracks of his hideout. The victories of the past, the heists, the escapes, now felt hollow, meaningless against the relentless approach of justice. Families of victims lit candles in silent vigils. Each flickering flame told a story of pain, loss, and hope. Each photo they held was a reminder that the shadows he had created stretched far beyond himself. SWAT teams moved into position outside. Helicopters hovered overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. Drones scanned every rooftop. Every possible exit was covered. Every move was anticipated. Back inside, he paced, heart pounding, eyes darting at every shadow. The hideout that once offered protection now felt like a prison. Every corner, every door, seemed to whisper that freedom was no longer possible. And so, after decades of evasion, the moment had arrived. The night that had once belonged to him was now dominated by justice. The shadows he had mastered were closing in, and the final confrontation was imminent. The man had grown clever with each passing year, learning how to slip through the cracks of the system. Minor thefts turned into major schemes, and every close call only made him bolder. In the quiet corners of the city, he plotted his next moves. Maps, notes, and hidden compartments surrounded him. Each decision was a calculated risk, each ally carefully chosen, or carefully deceived. Meanwhile, the police were relentless. Analysts worked day and night, connecting the dots of a decades-long trail of crimes. They saw patterns that no one else had noticed, slowly piecing together the puzzle that would finally lead to him. He remembered the faces of those who had crossed him, the moments when trust turned to betrayal. In the shadows, he learned the rules of survival, and the cost of every mistake. Even as he planned, the past haunted him. Flashbacks of past heists, narrow escapes, and close calls filled his mind. Triumphs that once felt like victories now felt like chains, binding him closer to the inevitable. Outside, the city held its breath. Families lit candles in remembrance, whispering prayers for justice. Every flickering flame was a reminder of lives touched and forever changed by his actions. The authorities tightened their grip. Helicopters hummed overhead, drones scanned rooftops, and SWAT teams prepared to close in. Every escape route, every hiding place, was being mapped and covered. Inside the hideout, fear took hold. He moved from room to room, heart racing, eyes scanning for threats. The walls that once felt protective now pressed in like a trap, the shadows mocking him with their silence. He knew the end was near. The freedom he had once taken for granted was slipping away, replaced by a suffocating certainty. The night that had once been his ally was now a witness to his downfall. And as the sirens grew louder and the first lights of the police entered the street, he realized there would be no more running. The final confrontation had begun, and justice would not be denied. As the years passed, his crimes grew darker, more calculated, and more dangerous. What began as small acts of deception slowly transformed into a ruthless criminal empire built on fear, money, and silence. Behind closed doors, he learned to manipulate people, businesses, and even law enforcement. Illegal deals, underground networks, and hidden financial trails became part of his daily life. To the outside world, he appeared untouchable. But every empire built on lies eventually begins to crack. Whispers spread in the criminal underworld. Former allies started turning against him, driven by fear, guilt, or the promise of freedom. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered shocking evidence, hidden accounts, secret meetings, and links to organized crime. What once looked like isolated incidents now formed a terrifying pattern of power and control. He remembered the moment he crossed the line, the first crime that changed him forever. The moment he realized there was no turning back, no redemption, only a road deeper into darkness. At night, His mind replayed the faces of victims, witnesses, and rivals. Some he had silenced, others had disappeared. The weight of his past began to press heavily on his conscience, if any remained. Outside, the public remained unaware of how close they had been to danger. Families mourned loved ones, communities demanded answers, and the pressure on law enforcement intensified. Detectives worked tirelessly, driven by one mission: to expose the truth and bring down the man who had escaped justice for so long. Each new discovery brought them closer to the final breakthrough. But the criminal felt it too: the shift in the air, the tightening circle, the invisible countdown ticking toward his capture. The streets that once felt like his kingdom now felt hostile and dangerous. And deep inside, he began to understand a terrifying reality: the world he built on deception was collapsing, and soon, he would be forced to face the consequences of every choice he had ever made. His criminal network continued to expand, stretching across cities, businesses, and underground markets. Illegal trades, corruption, and hidden partnerships fueled an empire that thrived in secrecy. To many people, he appeared to be a successful businessman, calm, confident, and untouchable. But behind the polished image was a mastermind orchestrating crimes that destroyed countless lives. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began sharing information, forming a special task force dedicated to bringing him down. What started as a local investigation had now become a national priority. A major breakthrough came when a former associate decided to talk. Fear, regret, and desperation pushed the insider to reveal hidden operations, secret codes, and financial trails that had never been discovered before. Investigators uncovered shocking details: illegal money flows, falsified documents, underground meetings, and connections to violent crimes. Each discovery peeled back another layer of the dark truth. The media soon caught wind of the case. Headlines spread across the nation, calling him one of the most dangerous and elusive criminals in modern history. Public outrage began to rise. Victims and their families stepped forward, sharing emotional stories of loss, pain, and unanswered questions. The nation demanded accountability. Justice could no longer be delayed. Meanwhile, he sensed something was changing. Deals started failing. Trusted partners vanished. Phone calls went unanswered. The once loyal network around him began to crumble. At night, paranoia took over. Every sound felt suspicious. Every stranger felt like a threat. The fear he had once inflicted on others now followed him relentlessly. And as the pressure mounted, he realized the truth: the empire he had built through deception, power, and fear was beginning to collapse, and the countdown to his downfall had truly begun. The investigation reached a critical stage. Surveillance intensified, warrants were issued, and undercover agents moved silently through the criminal underworld, gathering the final pieces of evidence. Authorities tracked suspicious financial transactions, secret properties, and coded communications. Every step revealed just how far his influence had spread, and how dangerous he truly was. But he was not unaware. He sensed the tightening grip of the law. His routines changed, his movements became unpredictable, and his trust in everyone around him began to disappear. Late at night, he packed bags filled with cash, documents, and emergency plans. Escape routes were drawn, fake identities prepared, and backup hideouts secured. He knew time was running out. Meanwhile, law enforcement prepared a massive coordinated operation. Multiple agencies worked together, mapping his locations, monitoring his contacts, and planning the moment of capture. The tension in the air was undeniable. Officers waited in unmarked vehicles, helicopters hovered above city lights, and tactical teams stood ready for action at a moment's notice. He attempted to flee, moving between safe houses, avoiding familiar places, cutting ties with former allies. But the walls continued to close in, faster than he had ever imagined. A high-stakes chase unfolded across dark streets and hidden backroads. Sirens echoed in the distance, lights flashed through the night, and every second felt like a race against fate. In his mind, memories replayed: the rise of his empire, the crimes he committed, the people he betrayed, and the power he once held. The fear he had inflicted on others now consumed him. And as dawn approached, he realized a haunting truth: no matter how far he ran, the past would always follow, and justice was closer than ever. The operation reached its final phase. After years of investigation, surveillance, and intelligence gathering, law enforcement prepared for the moment they had been waiting for: the capture of one of America's most notorious criminals. Every movement was carefully planned. Tactical teams reviewed strategies, communication lines were secured, and officers mentally prepared for a confrontation that could change history. Meanwhile, unaware of how close the authorities truly were, he continued to run, switching locations, abandoning trusted allies, and relying only on his instincts and fear. But the world he once controlled was now collapsing. Safe houses were compromised. Financial trails were exposed. The network that once protected him had begun to betray him. Late one night, police surrounded a secluded property believed to be his final hideout. Silent vehicles positioned themselves strategically. Officers moved into place with absolute precision. Inside, he sensed something was wrong. The silence felt heavier than usual. Every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow felt alive. Then it happened, the final approach. Doors were secured. Escape routes were blocked. The man who had evaded justice for decades found himself trapped by the very system he had once mocked. In a matter of moments, it was over. He was taken into custody, alive, shocked, and stripped of the power he once held. The empire built on fear collapsed in a single night. News of the arrest spread instantly. Television networks interrupted programming. Social media exploded. Headlines called it one of the biggest criminal captures in modern American history. Victims' families reacted with tears, relief, and disbelief. For some, it felt like closure. For others, it reopened painful memories that could never truly heal. Crowds gathered outside courthouses. Reporters demanded answers. The public wanted to understand how one man could cause so much damage, and how he managed to escape for so long. And as he sat in custody, staring at the reality of his downfall, he realized something chilling. The power, fear, and influence he once commanded had vanished, leaving behind only consequences. But this was not the end of the story. In fact, it was only the beginning of the most revealing chapter: his confession, his trial, and the truth behind every crime he had ever committed. In a cold, silent interrogation room, the man sat across from investigators, no longer the untouchable mastermind, but a prisoner facing the weight of his own past. The walls that once echoed with his power now reflected his vulnerability. Gone were the disguises, the influence, the control. All that remained was a man and the consequences of his choices. Detectives laid out decades of evidence, financial records, witness testimonies, surveillance footage, and classified intelligence. Every crime, every connection, every secret was now on the table. At first, he remained silent, calm, calculated, but silence cannot outrun truth forever. Slowly, under pressure, his composure began to crack. He spoke of his childhood, a life marked by neglect, ambition, resentment, and an early hunger for control. What began as a desire for power slowly transformed into a dangerous obsession. He described the first crime that changed everything. The moment he realized how easily he could manipulate systems, people, and opportunities. That single decision reshaped the course of his life. As hours passed, fragments of confession emerged. He revealed hidden operations, secret partnerships, and the structure of the criminal empire he had built. Investigators listened carefully, aware that every word uncovered another layer of truth, and another wound left behind in the lives of his victims. At times, his voice faltered. Memories resurfaced, moments of fear, arrogance, regret, and the heavy realization that he could never undo the damage he had caused. Psychologists analyzed his behavior, searching for motives, patterns, and the psychological forces that had driven him to cross every moral boundary. Was he a mastermind shaped by ambition, or a broken man shaped by circumstance? The answer lay somewhere between darkness and human weakness. And as the interrogation continued, one truth became undeniable: his rise to power was built on deception, but his fall would be built on the truth. The trial began under intense national attention. Courtrooms filled with reporters, legal experts, victims' families, and citizens eager to witness the downfall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. He entered the courtroom in chains, a striking contrast to the powerful figure he once was. Cameras flashed. Headlines were written before the verdict was even spoken. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: financial records, intercepted communications, witness statements, and detailed timelines of crimes spanning decades. One by one, victims and their families took the stand. Their voices trembled as they shared stories of loss, fear, heartbreak, and lives forever changed by his actions. Some spoke through tears, others spoke with controlled anger. Every testimony painted a painful picture of suffering, reminding the courtroom that behind every crime were real human lives. Defense attorneys attempted to shift blame, to explain his past, to argue psychological influence, but the weight of the evidence proved impossible to ignore. Legal analysts debated the case on television. Social media erupted with opinions, outrage, and demands for justice. The entire nation seemed to hold its breath. Meanwhile, he sat silently, listening to the consequences of his actions spoken aloud. Every testimony, every accusation, stripped away another layer of his former power. At times, his expression remained cold. At others, it revealed regret, or perhaps fear of the fate awaiting him. The illusion of control he once possessed had vanished completely. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Some sought closure, others sought understanding. All wanted one thing: accountability. The trial became more than a legal proceeding. It became a national reckoning, a symbol of justice against corruption, crime, and abuse of power. And as closing arguments approached, one question remained in the minds of millions: what punishment could ever equal the damage he had caused? The day of the verdict arrived, a moment the entire nation had been waiting for. The courtroom fell silent as the judge entered, and the weight of history hung heavily in the air. The jury returned after hours of deliberation. Their faces revealed the gravity of their decision. Every breath in the courtroom seemed to pause. The verdict was read aloud: guilty on all major charges. A single sentence echoed through the room, marking the end of a criminal empire and the beginning of accountability. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Some victims cried in relief. Others closed their eyes, finally feeling a sense of justice after years of pain. Outside, crowds reacted instantly. Some applauded, others stood silently, reflecting on the magnitude of the case and the suffering it represented. The judge prepared to announce the sentence. The room grew tense once more, as the consequences of decades of wrongdoing were about to be finalized. The punishment was severe, a sentence meant to reflect the seriousness of the crimes, the lives impacted, and the message that justice must prevail. As he listened to the sentence, his expression changed. The confidence that once defined him faded into a quiet, heavy realization: this was the end of the life he had built. He was given a moment to speak. Slowly, he stood and addressed the court. His voice was softer now, stripped of arrogance, touched by regret and reflection. He spoke of choices, of mistakes, of ambition that turned into destruction. He acknowledged the harm he had caused, though no words could undo the damage. Then, escorted by officers, he was led away, no longer a feared figure, but a man facing the consequences of his own actions. Behind prison walls, his world became smaller. No power, no influence, only time to reflect, to remember, and to confront the reality of what he had done. But even as his story seemed to end, the impact of his actions would live on, in the memories of victims, in the lessons learned, and in the reminder that justice, though slow, can prevail. The final chapter of his life unfolded in silence. Inside the prison walls, the world he once controlled felt impossibly distant, like a forgotten dream. His final night was quiet. No celebrations, no power, no allies, only memories of choices that built his rise, and decisions that led to his fall. In a small, dimly lit room, he agreed to a final interview. A rare moment, one last opportunity to tell his story in his own words. The interviewer asked a simple question: do you regret what you've done? The room fell silent as he stared into the distance, wrestling with a lifetime of consequences. He spoke slowly, about ambition, greed, fear, control, and the moment he realized he had gone too far. His voice trembled as he admitted that no amount of power was worth the pain he had caused. He reflected on his victims. The families, the lives destroyed, the futures stolen. For the first time, his words carried genuine remorse rather than arrogance. He spoke of his childhood, the early warning signs, the turning points, the moments where he could have chosen a different path. If I could speak to my younger self, he said, I would tell him that power fades, fear fades, but consequences last forever. As the final hours passed, he wrote a letter, not for fame, but for accountability. A message meant to warn others not to follow the same path of destruction. When dawn arrived, he took a final look at the world, a world that would continue long after his story ended. Escorted quietly, he walked toward the moment that would mark the end of his life, no longer as a feared criminal but as a cautionary tale remembered by history. And as the final chapter closed, one truth remained: crime may build empires, but justice will eventually bring them down. His story would not be remembered for his power, but for the lessons his downfall left behind. This is not just the story of a criminal. This is a warning, a reflection, and a reminder that every choice shapes a destiny. The execution marked the end of one life, but not the end of the pain left behind. As news of his death spread across the nation, reactions poured in. Some felt relief, some felt sorrow, Others felt an emptiness that justice could never fully heal. For the families of his victims, it was a moment of closure, not happiness, but a quiet sense that a long chapter of suffering had finally reached its end. Years of fear, unanswered questions, and silent grief slowly began to transform into acceptance, though the scars would remain forever. Counselors, journalists, and legal experts reflected on the case. How could one man rise to such power? How did the system fail to stop him sooner? And what lessons could society learn from his crimes? Schools discussed the case. Law enforcement reviewed mistakes. Communities began conversations about crime, morality, accountability, and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. His story became more than a crime case. It became a cautionary tale, studied in criminal psychology, law enforcement training, and social responsibility. Experts analyzed his mind, his hunger for control, his lack of empathy, his desire for dominance. Was he born this way, or shaped by environment and choices? Perhaps both. But one truth remained undeniable. No matter the cause, the damage he caused could never be undone. Meanwhile, survivors began rebuilding their lives. Some turned their pain into activism. Others chose healing in silence. Each carried their own journey of recovery. Memorials were created. Stories were told. The victims' names became symbols of strength rather than forgotten statistics. Years later, people would still speak of the case, not to glorify the criminal, but to honor the victims and remember the cost of unchecked power and cruelty. In documentaries, books, and courtrooms, his name would fade, but the lessons would remain. His rise proved how ambition can corrupt. His fall proved how justice, though slow, will eventually prevail. And perhaps the most important lesson of all, that every human being has a choice. A choice to protect, a choice to harm, a choice to walk toward light or disappear into darkness. This story is not meant to glorify evil. It is meant to remember the innocent, warn the reckless, and remind the world that accountability matters. Because power fades, fear fades, fame fades, but truth, and consequences, endure. If there is one message to take from this story, it is this: no one is above justice. No crime remains hidden forever. And no darkness lasts without facing the light. Thank you for listening to this true crime documentary. May it serve as a reminder to seek justice, protect the vulnerable, and choose humanity over harm. This was not just a criminal story, it was a story of consequences, courage, and the cost of choices. And this is where the story ends. Behind cold steel bars, his world became silent, stripped of power, stripped of control, stripped of identity. The man who once ruled through fear now followed prison routines like any other inmate. No special treatment, no influence, no escape. Days blurred into nights. Silence became louder than chaos. And for the first time in his life, he was forced to sit alone with his thoughts. He replayed his past, the crimes, the lies, the manipulation, the lives destroyed. Faces he had once ignored now haunted his dreams. Some nights, sleep refused to come. Memories returned like ghosts, whispering reminders of irreversible choices. Psychologists monitored him closely. They noted signs of emotional instability, suppressed guilt, and an increasing awareness of his moral collapse. He spoke to counselors, not as a criminal mastermind, but as a broken man trying to understand how ambition turned into destruction. He admitted that power had once made him feel invincible, but isolation had now made him feel human. He wrote letters he would never send. Apologies that could never undo the harm. Confessions that arrived far too late. In quiet moments, he wondered if his life could have been different, if a single decision, a single mentor, a single moment of compassion could have changed everything. But regret cannot rewrite history. It can only remind us of what we have lost. And inside those prison walls, he finally realized the truth: the empire he built on fear had collapsed, leaving behind only consequences. Long before the courtroom, before the capture, before the empire crumbled, he was just a man with ambition, hungry for control, hungry for power. In his early days, small crimes seemed harmless: petty thefts, manipulations, minor scams. But each act sharpened his skills, each deception strengthened his confidence. He learned quickly how to read people, how to exploit weaknesses, how to silence threats before they grew. Then came the first major crime, a moment that changed everything. One victim, one mistake, one irreversible action that marked the start of a dark path. He didn't see it as a turning point then. To him, it was a lesson, a proof that fear could be used as currency, and obedience could be bought. Soon, he built a network, trusted associates who carried out his orders, businesses that served as fronts, accounts hidden behind layers of secrecy. Each connection, each deal, expanded his reach. He became untouchable, at least in his own mind. But behind the success, a trail of suffering grew. Families lost loved ones. Innocents were manipulated, deceived, or worse. And yet, he thrived in this shadow world, believing he was smarter than everyone, immune to consequences. In flashbacks, he remembered his first taste of real power, the fear he could invoke, the control he could command. That moment became the foundation of a criminal empire that would one day terrorize entire communities. Little did he know, those early choices were the seeds of his own destruction, the roots of a story that would end in a courtroom, prison, and ultimately, a cautionary tale for generations. After his first major crime, law enforcement began noticing patterns. At first, the signs were subtle: a missing person report here, a suspicious transaction there, easily dismissed by many, but not by the keen eyes of investigators. Detectives started piecing together fragments of information. Phone records, travel logs, and small inconsistencies in witness statements hinted at a larger, more organized operation. Meanwhile, he grew bolder. Confidence from his first, successful, crime made him take risks he might have avoided before. He moved quickly, trusted the wrong people, and overlooked tiny details. He believed his network was impenetrable, that every move was calculated, that no one could trace his steps. But small errors began to leave traces, breadcrumbs that investigators slowly started to follow. First reports came in anonymously. Neighbors mentioned suspicious late-night visitors, employees reported odd behavior, and financial anomalies were noticed by a bank official. Each seemed insignificant alone, but together they created a pattern. His arrogance became his weakness. The very same confidence that had allowed him to rise now blinded him to scrutiny. He didn't realize that his empire was no longer invisible. Investigators began surveillance on his associates, slowly mapping his network. They documented meetings, tracked cash flows, and recorded conversations that would later become critical evidence. At this stage, he was still untouchable to the public eye, but the net was tightening, unseen, slow, but relentless. Every misstep, every oversight, was being quietly monitored. And he continued, unaware, building the very trail that would eventually lead law enforcement to him, step by step, until the day they would finally corner him. This was the beginning of the end, the first cracks in a once invincible criminal life. By now, the pressure was building, not from the law alone, but from the cracks in his own network. Associates grew nervous, mistakes multiplied, and whispers of suspicion began to circulate. He tried to move quietly, changing locations, using fake names, and relying on his network for cover. But every move left subtle traces: a receipt, a vehicle sighting, a forgotten conversation, that investigators slowly began connecting. Law enforcement intensified surveillance. Cameras were installed near key locations, phone calls were monitored, and undercover agents moved closer, blending into the background of his life. Even small oversights became dangerous. He trusted a courier too much. He repeated routines too often. He underestimated how meticulous investigators had become. Each minor error created a domino effect. One missed signal led to another, creating a chain that investigators quietly documented and analyzed. Inside his mind, he remained confident, unaware that the walls were closing in. He believed his reputation and experience made him untouchable, but the very patterns that had built his empire were now becoming evidence against him. The first signs of real vulnerability appeared: a mistaken transaction traced to him, a meeting location observed by an undercover agent, an associate speaking out of fear. Though the public still saw only the image of a powerful criminal, behind the scenes, the hunt had intensified. Every decision, every action, was being tracked, mapped, and analyzed. And with every step he took to escape, the net tightened, until the day would come when there would be no way out. The chase became more complex. Every move he made was shadowed by unseen eyes. He had thought he was clever, always one step ahead, but law enforcement had adapted to his patterns. Undercover agents infiltrated his circle. Associates who once trusted him now became reluctant informants, sharing glimpses of meetings, transactions, and secrets. Each new revelation tightened the net. Safe houses were compromised. Routes he once considered secure were now monitored. Vehicles he thought untraceable were being tracked with precision. The pressure began to show on him. Sleep eluded him. Paranoia crept into his thoughts. Every sound, every shadow, seemed like a threat. In private, he began questioning his choices. The empire he had built through cunning and fear now felt like a trap, a maze with no exit. His network, once loyal, now wavered under scrutiny. Friends turned cautious. Allies questioned orders. The man who had ruled through intimidation now found himself isolated. Psychological tension mounted. Anxiety, frustration, and exhaustion mixed, eroding the confidence that had once been his strongest weapon. Law enforcement continued to exploit every opening. Every intercepted call, every observed meeting, and every reported movement became pieces of the puzzle that would eventually corner him. Despite his efforts to stay invisible, the reality was unavoidable. The game was over. The hunter had become the hunted, and the walls were closing in faster than he could comprehend. And in those moments of fear and reflection, he realized that the power he once wielded had become the very chain that would bind him forever. By now, law enforcement had pieced together the full map of his movements. Safe houses, travel routes, associates, nothing was left unchecked. Detectives and tactical units planned the capture meticulously. Every angle, every contingency, every possible escape route was considered. Meanwhile, he felt the pressure. Rumors of investigation leaks reached him. Associates whispered warnings. Every step he took was measured with growing paranoia. He tried one last attempt to escape, moving under the cover of night, changing vehicles, and relying on his trusted network. But the police were prepared. Surveillance had become almost omnipresent. Small mistakes, accumulated over weeks, now made the difference. A wrong turn, a delayed meeting, a phone call intercepted at the wrong moment. He could sense the net tightening, but his pride refused to accept defeat. Confidence that had carried him through decades now turned into desperation. The tactical units moved silently, closing in. Every maneuver was calculated to avoid unnecessary risk, but ensure capture. And then it happened, the moment he realized there was no escape. Cornered in a seemingly ordinary building, with nowhere left to hide, the empire of fear he had built finally crumbled. Police surrounded him. Officers approached carefully, weapons ready, commands clear. The man who had eluded capture for years now faced the inescapable. He raised his hands, not with defiance, but with a quiet acceptance. The chase was over. The fugitive, the mastermind, was finally in custody. And in that moment, the story shifted, from the thrill of pursuit to the certainty of consequences, from fear and power to accountability and justice. Once in custody, the atmosphere changed completely. The man who had ruled through fear now faced a different kind of power, the scrutiny of law enforcement, the weight of evidence, and the unrelenting psychological pressure of interrogation. Detectives began the questioning carefully, methodically. Every word, every hesitation, every reaction was noted, dissected, and used to understand the mind of a criminal mastermind. At first, he tried to maintain his composure. Arrogance and defiance had carried him through countless situations. But now, in a sterile room under bright lights, those traits seemed fragile. Hours passed. Questions were repeated in different ways. Evidence was presented strategically. His memory was challenged. Allies' statements were introduced. The pressure began to wear him down. Confidence faltered. Arrogance gave way to frustration. And for the first time in decades, he truly felt cornered, powerless, exposed, and vulnerable. Then came the first confessions, small admissions, seemingly minor, yet each one chipped away at the wall of denial he had built around himself. He spoke reluctantly at first, testing the reactions of his interrogators, carefully choosing words, trying to minimize responsibility. But the weight of accumulated evidence made pretense impossible. By the end of the first day, the first cracks appeared. He admitted to certain crimes, certain manipulations. He did not yet fully grasp the enormity of everything, but the pressure was undeniable. Psychologists observing the session noted clear signs of stress, guilt, and cognitive dissonance. The man who had once seemed untouchable now showed the very human weaknesses that would eventually lead to full accountability. And as the interrogation ended, a new reality settled in. The empire he had built on fear was fully dismantled, piece by piece, by the very law he had once believed he could evade. As the second day of interrogation began, the pressure intensified. Investigators strategically introduced evidence linking him to multiple crimes, highlighting connections he could no longer deny. Slowly, the confessions became deeper, not just minor offenses, but the full extent of his criminal operations. Details about accomplices, illegal deals, and hidden networks emerged. He named associates who had helped him move money, hide evidence, and intimidate witnesses. Every revelation gave authorities new leads, further dismantling the empire he had built over years. At first, he hesitated to speak certain names, calculating the consequences. But the weight of evidence, the relentless questioning, and the isolation wore him down. He recounted key events in his operations, meticulously describing methods, locations, and the people involved. Each confession confirmed the suspicions investigators had carefully documented. For the first time, he admitted the human cost of his actions, the lives ruined, the fear spread, the families harmed. There was no pretense, no deflection, only a stark acknowledgement of guilt. Psychologists noted the emotional toll. This man, who had once exuded confidence and control, now trembled under the realization of what he had done. Investigators pressed further, connecting him to cold cases, financial crimes, and unsolved incidents. He provided information that would eventually lead to arrests, recovery of assets, and closure for victims. Each confession was a piece of the puzzle falling into place. His empire of fear was now an open book, fully exposed to the light of justice. And with each word, the story of his rise and fall became not just a case, but a lesson, a cautionary tale about ambition, arrogance, and the inevitability of consequences. With the confessions coming, investigators began analyzing not just the crimes, but the mind behind them. They studied his leadership, his manipulations, and the way he orchestrated a complex web of fear and loyalty. He had led with charisma to some, with intimidation to others. His associates followed orders out of fear, respect, or self-interest. But now, stripped of power, he reflected on the choices that had defined his reign. Psychologists observed him carefully. He alternated between arrogance, denial, and moments of deep regret. Patterns of control, calculation, and occasional remorse emerged clearly in his behavior. He began speaking of the moral dilemmas he had ignored, the lines he had crossed, and the moments he had justified violence and deception in the name of ambition. Investigators used this insight to map out the network's structure, understanding who held power, who feared consequences, and who had been coerced into participation. In quiet moments alone, he contemplated the human cost: friends turned enemies, lives destroyed, families traumatized. For the first time, he seemed to truly grasp the depth of his actions. Even as he shared details of operations, he admitted that control had been an illusion. The loyalty he commanded was fragile, and every calculated risk had ultimately contributed to his downfall. He began to articulate a final realization: that power achieved through fear and manipulation is always temporary, and the consequences are inevitable. For the investigators, each admission not only confirmed evidence but provided critical insight into criminal psychology, the motivations of accomplices, and the mechanisms of a fractured empire. And for him, the awareness of inevitability weighed heavily, a stark contrast to the confidence he had once felt in his untouchable rise. He began recounting each crime with a chilling clarity, as if reliving every moment, the planning, the execution, the aftermath. For the first major incident, he described how he selected the victim, studied their routine, and ensured no witnesses would interfere. Every detail was precise: the route taken, the timing, and the method used. He explained the manipulation of his accomplices, instructing them in subtle ways, ensuring fear and loyalty would keep them silent. Each step was calculated to avoid detection, yet every step left traces investigators would later discover. The second crime followed a similar pattern: careful observation, isolation of the target, and execution with cold efficiency. He spoke of the emotional detachment required to carry out such acts, almost as if he had built a protective barrier around his conscience. He recalled the crime scene vividly, the surroundings, the reactions of bystanders, the steps taken to remove evidence. Nothing was left to chance, yet the very meticulousness later became crucial for investigators to link him definitively to the acts. With each confession, the weight of human cost became apparent. Families destroyed, communities terrorized, innocence lost. He acknowledged the ripple effect of fear and grief, though remorse was still limited, filtered through his need for control. Investigators noted that the precision in his storytelling revealed not only his involvement but also the mindset of a meticulous planner, someone who saw people as pieces in a game rather than human beings. Every confession added a piece to the puzzle, confirming suspicions and connecting dots across years of criminal activity. His empire, once hidden in shadows, was now fully illuminated. And as he finished recounting these crimes, he sat quietly, perhaps the first time in years, aware of the irreversible impact of every choice he had made. After recounting the major crimes, he shifted to the broader network, the operations that supported his empire, the cover-ups, and the mechanisms that kept his criminal activities hidden for years. He described how associates were instructed to mislead authorities, manipulate witnesses, and erase digital and physical evidence. Each operation was coordinated meticulously, yet cracks in the network slowly began to appear under investigative pressure. Investigators revealed to him the progress of their surveillance, phone taps, financial tracking, and intercepted communications, showing him that no secret was safe. The realization unsettled him deeply. He spoke about decisions that had seemed necessary at the time, threats, bribes, and manipulations, and how each choice contributed to a fragile web of control, always at risk of collapsing. Every confession revealed more than just crimes. It exposed the psychology of a man who calculated risk against loyalty, fear against obedience, and power against conscience. He admitted the stress, the paranoia, and the mental toll of maintaining control over his associates. Sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and the fear of betrayal had shaped him into someone both ruthless and increasingly unstable. The investigators pressed on, detailing unsolved incidents and missing links. He acknowledged involvement indirectly at first, then gradually gave full accounts, realizing that resistance was futile. By the end of this session, a clear picture emerged, not just of crimes committed, but of a fractured empire, a web of fear, and a man whose mind had been consumed by the demands of power and control. And as he reflected, he realized that the decisions made to protect himself and his empire had only hastened its collapse, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and entirely accountable. With the confessions complete, the focus shifted to what was next, the trial. Legal teams reviewed every piece of evidence, every confession, and every network connection. The weight of impending justice settled heavily on him. In solitary moments, he reflected on the choices that had led to this point. The rise, the crimes, the network, the betrayals, all replayed vividly in his mind. Anxiety, guilt, and regret mixed with the stubborn remnants of arrogance. Family members, who had once been peripheral to his world of control, now watched as reality set in. Some expressed disbelief, others shame, and a few attempted to reconcile with the truth. Their reactions became another mirror to the consequences of his actions. He began internal self-analysis, why he had made certain decisions, how ambition had overridden morality, and how fear had been both a tool and a prison. Investigators continued preparations for trial, briefing prosecutors on patterns of behavior, confessions, and witness testimonies. Every detail he had provided in interviews shaped the strategy for courtroom presentation. He faced each day with a mix of resignation and tension, aware that the courtroom would not only judge his crimes but dissect his very personality, decisions, and influence over others. In quiet moments, he offered further admissions, not because he was forced, but perhaps as a way to reconcile with his conscience. A final confession, acknowledging the human suffering he had caused, and the irreversible consequences of his ambition. The stage was set, evidence was ready, witnesses prepared. The man who had once eluded capture and controlled fear now waited for the legal system to determine the final chapter of his story. And in that anticipation, the enormity of his actions weighed fully upon him, a stark contrast to the confidence that had carried him through decades of crime. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Journalists, families of victims, and the public had gathered, eager to witness the trial of a man whose crimes had shocked communities for years. The prosecution opened with a compelling narrative, presenting evidence meticulously collected, confessions, financial records, witness statements, and surveillance footage. The story was clear, a life built on crime, manipulation, and fear. Witness after witness took the stand. Some spoke of intimidation, others of betrayal, and some recalled moments of fear that still haunted them. Each testimony painted a vivid picture of the chaos and suffering caused by the accused. The defense attempted to challenge credibility, highlight inconsistencies, and humanize their client. They emphasized remorse, the influence of associates, and psychological pressure that may have shaped decisions. In the gallery, families listened intently, some tearful, some stoic. Media coverage captured every moment, broadcasting the proceedings to an audience far beyond the courthouse. The accused remained composed outwardly, but internally he wrestled with guilt, fear, and the gravity of what he had done. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, reminded him of the empire he had lost and the lives affected. As the first day of the trial concluded, it became clear, this would not be just a legal battle, but a narrative of human ambition, morality, and consequence played out for the world to see. Public sentiment grew strong, with debates on accountability, justice, and the psychological factors driving criminal behavior. The courtroom had become a stage for a real-life drama, and he was both actor and subject. And through it all, he understood that this was the final arena where his story would be judged, not by fear or manipulation but by law and public scrutiny. After days of witness testimonies and legal arguments, the trial moved toward its climax. Both prosecution and defense delivered their closing statements, summarizing evidence and appealing to the jury's sense of justice and fairness. The prosecution highlighted the meticulous planning, the calculated crimes, and the confessions that revealed the depth of the accused's criminal network. They stressed accountability, the human cost, and the need for justice to deter future crimes. The defense appealed to compassion, emphasizing remorse, psychological pressures, and the complexity of his circumstances. They urged the jury to weigh mitigating factors alongside the gravity of offenses. The judge provided clear instructions to the jury, reminding them to evaluate facts, evidence, and testimonies impartially. Legal definitions, burden of proof, and standards for conviction were explained thoroughly. As the courtroom fell silent, families of victims reflected on the journey to justice, the pain endured, the courage displayed, and the hope that the verdict would provide closure. The accused sat quietly, aware that the final decision rested with others. Each summation and instruction served as a reminder of the consequences of a life shaped by ambition and crime. Media outlets continued to report live, capturing emotional reactions, public debates, and the gravity of a case that had captivated the nation. In this moment, the courtroom transformed into a space where law, morality, and human emotion converged, where the story of rise, fall, and accountability would be sealed by judgment. And through it all, the man who had once evaded capture understood that this moment, above all others, would define the legacy of his actions. After days of deliberation, the jury finally returned to the courtroom. Silence fell over the room as everyone awaited the moment that would seal the fate of the accused. The 4% of the jury stood, holding the verdict. Every eye was fixed, every breath held, as the words that had been anticipated for months were about to be spoken. Guilty on multiple counts. The courtroom erupted with gasps, tears, and relief. Families of victims wept, embracing each other, a mix of sorrow and closure washing over them. Media cameras captured the raw emotions, reporters noting the significance of the verdict, commentators discussing the lessons of justice and accountability, and the public following every detail with intense interest. The accused remained seated, expressionless at first, then slowly showing the weight of reality. The pride, arrogance, and denial that had carried him for years dissolved under the undeniable judgment. Security led him away, and whispers of reflection, regret, and the cost of his actions followed him. For those who had suffered under his empire, justice was not just a word, it was a tangible, palpable outcome. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the impact remained. Conversations continued outside, in homes, offices, and newsrooms, about morality, crime, and the consequences of choices. And for the man who had once seemed untouchable, the finality of the verdict was the last confirmation. No empire built on fear can escape the inevitability of justice. The day of sentencing arrived. The courtroom was tense, filled with anticipation and the weight of justice about to be finalized. The judge entered, commanding silence. Every word carried gravity as the sentence was read aloud. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on multiple counts, restitution ordered where applicable, and restrictions clearly outlined. Families of victims reacted with relief, tears, and subdued celebration. For many, it was the closure they had long awaited, the acknowledgement of years of suffering and fear finally validated. Media coverage captured every reaction, live broadcasts, interviews with families, experts discussing the implications of the verdict, and public conversations online debating justice and accountability. The accused maintained a composed exterior, but internally, he confronted the finality of his actions. The life once filled with control, fear, and manipulation had ended in confinement and loss. Psychologists noted the subtle changes, resignation, reflection, and perhaps the beginnings of true remorse. The reality of consequences had fully set in, far beyond the controlled environment of interrogations or trials. Outside the courthouse, the story continued to resonate. Communities, news outlets, and social media engaged with the narrative, examining lessons about crime, morality, and the inescapable weight of justice. And as he was led away to begin his sentence, the empire built on fear had dissolved completely. Justice, in its finality, had spoken, leaving a lasting mark on everyone affected by his actions. In the end, the tale was no longer just about crime and punishment, it was a cautionary story about ambition, choices, human vulnerability, and the inevitability of consequences. In the weeks following sentencing, reflections on the case rippled through the community. Law enforcement agencies analyzed every aspect, using insights to refine investigative techniques and prevent similar criminal networks from rising. Victims and their families shared their experiences publicly, highlighting the courage it took to come forward and the importance of justice. Their voices became part of the lasting legacy of the case. The media continued coverage, dissecting the events, the investigation, and the courtroom drama. Public discussions explored criminal psychology, morality, and the societal impact of such high-profile crimes. Investigators offered final reflections, noting how meticulous work, patience, and persistence brought closure to a complex web of crimes. They emphasized the significance of collaboration, evidence collection, and ethical responsibility. For the convicted, reflection came in confinement. He reviewed his choices, understanding the irreversible consequences, the lives affected, and the network that ultimately failed him. The story became more than crime and punishment. It was a case study in human behavior, the fragility of trust, and the inevitable reckoning of unchecked ambition. Communities affected by the crimes began rebuilding, learning to move forward while honoring the lessons of vigilance, justice, and accountability. And though the accused had lost everything, the legacy of the case lived on, in law enforcement strategies, public awareness, and the voices of those whose lives were forever changed. This final reflection served as a reminder: no action exists in isolation, and every choice leaves an imprint on the world around us. As the case settled into history, experts turned their attention to understanding the mind behind the crimes. Criminologists and psychologists analyzed behavior patterns, motivations, and the environmental factors that shaped his actions. They noted a combination of ambition, calculated risk-taking, and emotional detachment. Early warning signs, social influences, and the manipulations of his network were dissected to understand how a life could spiral into organized criminality. The lessons were clear: unchecked ambition, a disregard for morality, and the cultivation of fear as a tool for control often lead to inevitable downfall. Each detail of the case provided insight for preventing similar trajectories in the future. Psychologists emphasize the human cost, not just to victims, but to perpetrators and their communities. The long-term psychological impact of fear, trauma, and manipulation resonated far beyond the courtroom. For the public, the story became a cautionary tale. Awareness, vigilance, and moral responsibility emerged as key takeaways. The narrative was no longer just a record of crimes, but a roadmap for understanding human behavior and societal consequences. Investigators, families, and communities all reflected on resilience, accountability, and the importance of justice. Each had learned, in their own way, the complex interplay between choice and consequence. And for the convicted, reflection continued in solitude. Understanding, perhaps for the first time, the full spectrum of human suffering caused, the responsibility for every life affected, and the lessons that even he could not escape. This final chapter offered a sobering perspective. Crime may rise from ambition, but justice, consequence, and human awareness endure beyond any empire of fear. As the trial, sentencing, and reflections concluded, the story entered its final chapter, a closure that tied together decades of actions, consequences, and lessons. The journey from early ambition, through criminal acts, evasion, and manipulation, to ultimate capture and justice, served as a comprehensive narrative of cause and effect. Families of victims found solace in accountability, communities learned resilience, and law enforcement gained insights for future cases. Each stakeholder carried forward lessons from the ordeal. The convicted, now confined, had the opportunity to reflect fully on the lives affected and the choices that led to his downfall. The empire built on fear and control had ended, leaving only the truth behind. From a broader perspective, the case became a reference for criminal psychology, legal strategy, and societal awareness. Discussions continued in academic, professional, and public forums, ensuring that the lessons endured. For the audience listening to this story, the takeaways were clear: unchecked ambition, moral compromise, and manipulation led inevitably to downfall, while justice, vigilance, and empathy prevail. The narrative, now complete, left a lasting impression, a chronicle of crime, consequence, and the resilience of the human spirit. And so, the story ends not just with punishment, but with reflection, learning, and the enduring truth that every choice has weight, and every action leaves its mark. This is the final chapter, the closure of a life's journey intertwined with crime, justice, and the enduring lessons for all who witness it.